3 events, 24 hours, and America will never look quite the same. Right now, as you watch this, American and Ukrainian diplomats are sitting across a table in Geneva, Switzerland, hammering out the terms of what could be the biggest peace deal since the Cold War ended. Across the same city on the very same day, American envoys are also meeting Iranian officials in what may be the last diplomatic off-ramp before a military strike on Tehran's nuclear facilities. And back in Washington, the United States Supreme Court's bombshell ruling against President Trump's signature tariffs is shaking markets, scrambling trade alliances, and triggering a constitutional showdown between the White House and the judiciary that nobody saw coming this fast. 3 fires burning simultaneously. And at the center of every single one of them, one man, one administration, and a set of decisions that will define not just America's next 4 years, but the balance of global power for a generation. I'm going to break all of it down for you: the Iran nuclear gamble, the Russia-Ukraine diplomatic chess match, the China trade tug-of-war, the collapse of the EU deal, and the domestic political earthquake unfolding inside the United States. We'll follow the money, follow the power, and tell you exactly what it all means for the American economy. Let's get into it. To understand everything happening in the world this week, you first have to understand what happened inside the United States Supreme Court just 6 days ago. On February 20th, 6 of the 9 justices handed down a ruling that effectively declared most of President Trump's emergency powers tariffs, the ones slapped on nearly every country on Earth under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, unconstitutional. The case, Learning Resources Inc. v. Trump, centered on a question that sounds almost dry in legal terms, but has trillion-dollar consequences. Can a president unilaterally use a national emergency declaration to impose sweeping taxes on global trade? The answer, according to the court's majority, was no. According to CNN's live reporting, President Trump did not take the ruling well. Standing at the White House podium shortly after the decision, he called it deeply disappointing and said he was ashamed of certain members of the court, calling the justices in the majority a disgrace to our nation. Within hours of that statement, Trump signed a new executive order imposing a 10% global tariff under a completely different legal authority, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, with plans to raise it to 15%. That tariff took effect on February 24th. Here is why this matters economically. According to the Tax Foundation's tariff tracker, the United States collected $287 billion in customs duties in 2025 alone, a staggering 192% increase over the prior year. Of that, an estimated $133.5 billion was collected under the very IEEPA authority the court just struck down. That money, according to legal analysts and business executives like Rick Woldenberg of Learning Resources, may now need to be refunded. Woldenberg told CNN directly his company paid over $10 million in IEEPA tariffs, and he expects the government to return every cent. The political fallout is compounding. Democrats on the House Armed Services, Intelligence, and Foreign Affairs committees immediately pushed back not just on tariffs, but on the Iran situation, demanding the president seek congressional authorization before any military action. Meanwhile, a federal class action lawsuit filed this week alleges that ICE agents in Maine labeled American citizens observing immigration enforcement operations as domestic terrorists, raising First Amendment alarms just months before the November midterm elections. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem publicly confirmed that immigration agents would not patrol polling places during the midterms, a clarification that reveals how politically sensitive enforcement operations have become. The net economic picture for American consumers is sobering. Even with the IEEPA tariffs invalidated, the overall average effective U.S. tariff rate still sits at approximately 13.7% as of this week, far above the 2.5% rate when Trump began his second term. Economists at NPR reported plainly that consumers should not expect cheaper prices anytime soon because the remaining Section 301 and Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, cars, and Chinese goods remain fully intact. As this script was being prepared, American and Iranian officials were meeting in Geneva for what sources describe as the most consequential nuclear negotiation since the original JCPOA in 2015. According to Just Security's morning briefing on February 26th, 4 Iranian officials told journalists that Iran's delegation is likely to offer a suspension of nuclear enrichment for 3 to 5 years. After that suspension period, Iran would join a regional nuclear consortium and maintain a very low level of enrichment, 1.5%, strictly for medical research. Iran would also offer to dilute the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium it currently holds, doing so in phases. The American position, reported by the Wall Street Journal and confirmed through multiple sources cited by Just Security, is considerably harder. Washington is demanding that Tehran dismantle its three main nuclear facilities, the enrichment sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, and transfer all enriched uranium out of the country entirely. In exchange, the United States would lift the threat of military strikes and relax some sanctions. That gap between the two positions, suspension versus dismantlement, is enormous, and whether it can be bridged in the hours and days ahead remains the central question. The military stakes could not be higher. Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, told CNN this week that the United States has assembled what he called the most significant American military deployment in the Middle East since the United States invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003. Multiple RC-135 Rivet Joint Reconnaissance Aircraft and E-3 Sentry radar planes are currently operating in the Iranian theater, according to military tracking analysts. This is not a bluff designed for theatrical effect. It is a real, operational force that costs billions of dollars to maintain. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told CBS's Face the Nation earlier this week that there was a good chance for a diplomatic solution and that he expected to hold further discussions with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff this week. But Professor Gerges flagged a darker possibility that Trump's domestic political troubles, particularly the Supreme Court humiliation over tariffs, could accelerate a decision to use military force as a pressure release valve. As he noted, American presidents historically have diverted attention from domestic challenges through overseas action. This is not idle speculation. It is pattern recognition based on decades of precedent. For the American economy, an Iran strike scenario carries severe consequences. Oil prices, already elevated, would spike sharply if military operations disrupted Gulf shipping lanes. Inflation, which the Federal Reserve has spent years fighting, would receive a powerful new upward impulse, and the defense spending required for a sustained operation would further widen an already stretched federal deficit. On the morning of February 26th, Rustem Umerov, Ukraine's top negotiator and Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, posted on the social platform X to confirm that his four-person delegation had begun meeting in Geneva with American envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Ukraine's economy minister Oleksiy Sobolev was also at the table. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, the two sides will discuss post-war reconstruction plans, preparations for the next meeting with Russia, and the mechanics of an expanded prisoner exchange. This bilateral meeting is itself a preparatory step toward a larger trilateral format involving Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, but that three-way meeting has now been postponed to early March. President Zelensky confirmed in remarks before the Geneva session that the big trilateral meeting had been pushed back to the beginning of March, likely to be held in Washington. Russian Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, was also reported to be in Geneva on this same day, but conducting separate contacts with American representatives on economic reconstruction issues. The broader context is one of grinding diplomatic stalemate. According to the UK House of Commons Library's February analysis, Russia continues to show little willingness to compromise on its core demand, recognition of its territorial gains in eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin's position, articulated bluntly by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in state media statements Thursday, is that Russia has no deadlines, only tasks. Lavrov's framing deliberately undermines Trump's stated goal of reaching a deal by July 4, 2026, the American Independence Day that the president has publicly cited as a target date for announcing a peace agreement. Trump's leverage, according to analysts at the Pravda USA assessment published this morning, comes from two directions simultaneously. He is exploiting the economic strain that sanctions and partial wartime mobilization have placed on the Russian economy, while at the same time building a joint American-Ukrainian framework from which he then presents conditions to Moscow rather than allowing Russia to set its own terms. This approach has put the Kremlin in an uncomfortable position. It must either accept proposals shaped by Kiev's red lines or risk being seen as the party blocking peace. Economically, a successful ceasefire would unlock enormous reconstruction contracts estimated by various international bodies at several $100 billion for American, European, and global firms. Trump has publicly tied reconstruction financing to American participation, meaning a deal would generate significant economic benefits for U.S. companies. The failure to reach a deal, by contrast, sustains a military assistance expenditure that American taxpayers continue to fund, even as the administration publicly questions its necessity. The Supreme Court's February 20th ruling has reshuffled the deck in the U.S.-China trade relationship, but not in the way most people might assume. According to the Associated Press, which carried a detailed analysis of the ruling's China implications, the decision would seem on the surface to strengthen China's negotiating position by removing the legal foundation for many of Trump's reciprocal tariffs. But analysts on both sides of the Pacific are counseling caution about reading too much advantage into the moment. Oliver Melton, a director at the Rhodium Group, told Marketplace that the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods has now fallen from the low 30s to approximately 21%. To put that in context, China's rate is now only marginally higher than that applied to countries like Turkey, Vietnam, Thailand, or India, meaning China's goods are more competitive against those rivals than at any point in the past year. But the Section 301 tariffs, which were applied specifically as a penalty for China's trade practices, remain fully in force, as do the Section 232 metals tariffs. Politically, the White House has confirmed that President Trump will travel to China on March 31st through April 2nd to meet President Xi Jinping. The AP reported that Xi is unlikely to publicly flaunt or brandish the court ruling when meeting Trump, choosing instead to strengthen his personal rapport with the American president, a deliberate diplomatic calculation by Beijing. Trump himself told reporters this week China had hundreds of billions of dollars in surpluses with the United States. They rebuilt China. They rebuilt the army. We built China's army by allowing that to happen. I have a great relationship with President Xi, but he respects our country now. Meanwhile, in a development that has received less attention than it deserves, the U.S. International Trade Commission announced this week that it is launching a formal investigation into the economic impact of revoking China's permanent normal trade relations status, entirely a move that would represent a dramatic escalation of decoupling. The report is due by August 2026. This investigation signals that elements within the U.S. policy apparatus are preparing for scenarios far more confrontational than what is currently on the table. Zongyuan Zoe Liu of the Council on Foreign Relations told Marketplace that the administration has been pretty clear about its intention to rebuild its tariff wall using other legal authority, meaning the court ruling may ultimately be a temporary dip rather than a structural change in the trade war trajectory. For American consumers, the practical implication is that the prices of electronics, appliances, and consumer goods, which had been inflating throughout 2025, are unlikely to fall significantly. The tariff architecture supporting those price increases remains largely intact. Across the Atlantic, the transatlantic relationship is facing its most serious test since the first Trump administration, and the stakes this time are even higher because a formal trade deal is now in jeopardy. The so-called Turnberry Agreement, reached in July 2025 between President Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, set U.S. tariffs on EU exports at 15% while committing the European Union to cut its own tariffs on American goods to zero. For months, it was treated as a landmark of pragmatic diplomacy. This week, it is on the verge of collapse. Following the Supreme Court ruling, the European Parliament on Monday, February 23rd, suspended its ratification process for the deal entirely. According to NBC News, EU lawmakers cited the new uncertainty over what tariff regime the United States would actually enforce. Bernd Lange, chair of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee, told reporters, "Nobody knows what will happen, and it's unclear if there will be additional measures or how the United States will really guarantee its end of the agreement." Within minutes of that announcement, Trump posted a social media warning that any country that wanted to play games with the court ruling would face a much higher tariff and worse. He ended the post with the phrase, "Buyer beware," but the EU's concerns go beyond mere uncertainty. According to Bloomberg's reporting on February 25th, the bloc has now formally calculated that approximately $4.2 billion worth of European exports are currently facing U.S. tariffs above the 15% ceiling, agreed in the Turnberry deal. The main culprit is a category of so-called Derivative products, goods made with steel or aluminum content, which were hit with a 50% tariff rate under Section 232. Lange told CNBC directly, on the U.S. side, there was a breaking of the agreement. This is a clear breaking on the side of the United States, and several times, and this is not certainty. On a somewhat more hopeful note, Bloomberg also reported on February 24th that European Union officials believe Washington may streamline its tariffs on steel and aluminum derivative products within weeks, a move by the Trump administration to reduce the list of goods subject to that punishing 50% rate could represent a goodwill gesture that keeps the Turnberry framework alive. But as of this writing, no formal announcement has been made. The broader geopolitical picture is concerning to analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. The EU is simultaneously dealing with Trump's pressure over Ukraine, his repeated suggestions that Greenland should come under American control, and now a tariff dispute that directly threatens European manufacturing jobs. Green Party MEP Anna Cavazzini captured the frustration bluntly. The EU is facing repeated coercive attempts by the US, but the member states are turning a blind eye to this reality. If the EU triggers its anti-coercion instrument, a retaliatory mechanism that could authorize counter-tariffs and exclusions of US firms from European public procurement, the economic consequences on both sides of the Atlantic would be severe. American exporters, from agricultural producers to aerospace manufacturers, would face new barriers in the world's largest single market. Pull back for a moment and look at the full picture, because the pattern is striking. In a single 24-hour period, the United States is conducting nuclear diplomacy with Iran in Geneva, peace diplomacy with Ukraine in Geneva, navigating a constitutional crisis over presidential economic power at home, managing a trade relationship with China that a court ruling just reshuffled, and facing the potential breakdown of a hard-won European trade deal. These are not unrelated events. They are all expressions of the same underlying tension. An administration that seeks to reorder global relationships at speed, and a world including American institutions that is pushing back. The economic thread running through all 5 of these stories is the tariff question. Trump's tariff strategy was built on the theory that unilateral American leverage could extract better terms from trading partners, fund domestic programs through customs revenue, and revive American manufacturing. The Supreme Court ruling does not end that strategy, but it constrains it significantly. The administration must now rebuild its tariff architecture using Section 122, which has a 150-day clock and requires congressional approval to extend an accelerated Section 301 investigations. That creates uncertainty for American businesses making investment decisions, for foreign governments deciding whether U.S. deals are worth signing, and for financial markets pricing in future trade policy. On the geopolitical side, the dual Geneva diplomatic track Iran and Ukraine simultaneously represents an extraordinary concentration of American diplomatic energy. Trump's team appears to be operating on the theory that visible momentum toward peace deals before November's midterm elections will translate into political reward at the ballot box. The risk is that premature deals, whether with Iran or with Russia, that sacrifice security guarantees for speed, could create instability that ultimately proves far more costly than the status quo. In the immediate term, watch Geneva. Both sets of talks, Iran nuclear and Ukraine peace, are active on February 26th. If the Iran talks produce even a preliminary framework, expect significant market reaction in oil prices and defense stocks. If they collapse without agreement, watch for escalatory military signaling from both sides in the days ahead. On the trade front, the key question is whether the EU triggers its anti-coercion instrument. European ambassadors are meeting this week to assess the situation. A decision to deploy the ACI would represent a significant escalation in transatlantic friction and could materially impact American export revenues. Bloomberg's reporting that the U.S. may ease steel derivative tariffs within weeks offers one potential off-ramp, but European officials are demanding formal, durable clarity, not informal reassurances. On China, all eyes turn to the March 31st Trump-Xi summit in Beijing. That meeting will be the most consequential U.S.-China engagement since the tariff war began. Watch for whether the administration attempts to revive a broader trade framework through personal diplomacy, and whether China offers new purchase commitments in exchange for tariff relief on the goods most critical to its exporters. Domestically, the question of tariff revenue refunds is unresolved. More than $133 billion in potentially illegal tariff collections are at stake. How the administration handles that question, whether it fights refund demands, offers structured repayment, or seeks congressional action to legitimize the revenue already collected, will shape business confidence and budget planning for the rest of the fiscal year. America is not just navigating policy decisions right now. It is navigating a fundamental question about what kind of power it wants to be in a world that is rapidly reorganizing around its choices. The Supreme Court reminded this week that even the most powerful executive is bound by law. Geneva reminded us that diplomacy and military force sit on a knife's edge. And the tariff battles on multiple fronts reminded us that every trade decision sends ripple effects through every household, every factory, and every pension fund in the country. The next 72 hours will tell us a great deal. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe, share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening right now, and leave a comment telling us which of these 5 storylines you think will have the biggest economic impact on American families. We read every single one. This is America at the Crossroads, and history is being written today.